Okay, I'm Paul Bristow and I'm based in Greenock in Inverclyde, and I write children's fiction, folk tales, ghost stories and comics, sometimes all at once. But writing I've always done, like, you know, as far back as I can really remember, and but when it became more of a real thing that I did, I was like about 8 or 9, and my gran, she had a typewriter and I was allowed to borrow it like once a month, and so when I got it I would just type away stuff. It felt more real when you were typing it up, so I started writing stories, and by the time I was like a teenager, I was performing as a stand-up comedian up in Glasgow and writing for the BBC, and this is while I was still at school. So and being paid for it, which was nice. As you can imagine, that sort of, you know, it made me lose focus a wee bit, maybe at school. But by the time actually I got to my 20s, I'd stopped doing it. I'd stopped doing all that, and it was only when myself, my brother, and a couple of friends got together that I started writing again. We had this idea, this kind of notion. We became a bit obsessed by that Inverclyde only tells one story of itself. It only ever talks about James Watt, industrialisation, sugar, shipyards and decline. And we wanted to try and like re-magic the landscape a wee bit and tell other types of stories, and look for other ways of looking at Inverclyde's history and past, and pretty much been writing stories like that in that area ever since, for ages now. Ages. I've done a couple of courses and things like that, but no, I've never sort of set out to, you know, I've not got a literature degree or anything like that. I read a lot, and I've always written a lot. And I talk to other writers and, you know, bounce ideas off of people, but no, I've never been formally trained as a writer as such. Yeah, well, I mean, there's two different types of things that I do, I suppose. I write all, you know, fiction and scripts, but also work with community groups to write things as well. Two slightly different processes, but for my own writing, for my personal writing, it starts with walking. So I walk all over the town. I love walking all over the town, and, you know, just the ideas or things will come to you. I quite like mashing things together that don't often seem like they'll go, and I'll over the course of a couple of weeks, all these wee ideas that are firing, I'll just kind of write them down longhand, like in a notebook, like a book of loads of big hardback notebooks that I use for it, and I just scribble it, but I don't do anything with it right away. And then after a couple of weeks, I go back to the things that I've written and start pulling it into some sort of shape and planning, you know, is it a longer story, there are chapters here and there, and then writing it out longhand as well. So I maybe write the first, you know, 10,000 words or something longhand, and then start typing it up. And it's then really that I try to make it make sense. So that's all, but always with a walk. It always starts with a walk and ideas forming as you stroll around and you're taking in what's around about you. So that's the process for my own writing. With community organisations where I work to help other people tell stories, it's about getting a group of people together and building a bit of a trust and a rapport, and you do that through different story exercises and things that we can all sort of do together, and then gradually, as you build up that trust and you start to share stories in a story circle, we can get to the point where we collaborate and people feel happy and trust one another to share their own personal stories or to work together to tell stories, and that's great fun as well. So that wee moment where that kind of happens is always great fun. I think, well, for community type work, it's that moment of realisation and collaboration where the momentum of the story and the conversation that people are having just generates its own energy and enthusiasm, and you've got all this discussion happening and you start pulling it all together. That's great. With my own personal writing, and I think I'm not alone in this, I think it's the start of a story. It's the, you know, when you are jotting down all those ideas, or when the stories first come to you and you're trying to think of how it all work. When you've then got all the words and you're trying to make them make sense, or you're having to edit them and all of that, less fun, you know, it's more of a jigsaw puzzle thing. But I really love the start. I love the the beginning of an idea that's great. I don't know very well, no other people are very good at sort of telling me that that's that done. What tends to be the end of a process for me is, oh, it's due in next week. so then that's the line drawn. Having deadlines like that is really helpful. Or we're working on particular projects where you know that something's got to be delivered for a specific time. That's a good way of focusing that. But I think I'm a bit of a tinkerer. You know, I go back and that word's wrong, or I prefer it to sound like this. In terms of writing, I think that, you know, the thing that, and I get asked a lot, and I go into schools a lot and sort of talk about writing and how people can get started. And I'm really big on this notion that to get started there isn't really any specialist equipment for writing. You really just need a bit of paper and a pen, and in that way it's quite accessible. You know, it's something that everybody has the opportunity to do, and it doesn't cost them anything, and there shouldn't be those kind of barriers to getting people in. But I do think that there are organisations and there are agencies and all sorts of things that can help you. The Scottish Book Trust, for example, are an amazing resource for people if you're somebody who's interested in writing. They've got an amazing newsletter full of opportunities and all of these things, and they've been an immense and enormous help to writers all over the country, but to me as well, because sometimes, you know, something will just sort of ping into your email, and it will be like there's an opportunity for, you know, they're looking for submissions for this kind of fiction, or there's a competition running on this kind of play or whatever, and so it's good, you know, to look for those things. But I think the main thing is to finish things, is to, you know, it's dead. Ideas are easy. Like I was saying earlier, that's the bit that it's easy to enjoy that bit, because it's brilliant and everything's fine. Finishing something's really hard. Well, I find it really hard. But the perseverance to do that, because nobody, if you're somebody who's interested in getting published traditionally, like through a publisher's, you know, people are going to want to see your first 5,000 words or something, and they're going to want to see a synopsis and all of that kind of stuff. And you might have those already, but if you don't have the finished thing, there's not really any point in submitting. You know, you're better to not think about what you're going to do with a piece of writing. Write it, do it just for you, then think about sending it out places, then think about showing it to other folk, and don't write to get published, I think. And I've self-published stuff and been traditionally published, and they're both different experiences, you know, but they both have about the same amount of work. You know, you have to promote in the same sort of way. And so another thing that I would advise people to do is think about that you don't necessarily need to be traditionally published. There's so many tools, again, free online tools that can help you edit your stuff and get it out there to people. So that might be the route for you as well. You don't necessarily need to wait for anybody else to sort of give you the green light. It's everything. I think, like, lots of people who live here have got quite a complicated relationship with Inverclyde. You know, I love it. I love living here, but like all sorts of love, it can drive you up the wall. And I think that it's an endlessly inspiring place. You know, the views are fantastic, but there's also something that's quite difficult about living here. You know, it's a tough place to be in, right? Sometimes it's got its hassles and its troubles. I've tended to work in communities where you know that's up front. It's obvious, and you can see that and hear from people how they're living their lives. But there's a sort of a resilience here which is really interesting, and the area's got a real voice of its own, and I like all of that as well. I like that it won't take any nonsense from people. I like that we have a very firm idea of who we are. But the history is inspiring, but in all honesty, even though I got into writing through history and heritage particularly, I think often Inverclyde's heritage can hold us back a little. We become obsessed with this one narrative, and that's why I think it's important to tell lots of different stories and look at lots and lots of different voices, because there's so much in there. It's not just that one story, there's so much more to know. There's two that I really like that are more like folk tales. One's in Port Glasgow, and I tell it a lot, and it's called Malky and the Bogle, and it's about the bogle of Boglestone at the top of the Clune Brae. I love that story and it's like, it was like a sort of a cautionary fable about not getting steaming at a Port Glasgow pub and walking back to Kilmacombe in the dark, right? That was what the original story was, and I love that story. But I also like the Port Glasgow Mermaid, because when I talk about this in schools, it's just always amazing. So there is a story, and there's lots of like woodcuts that illustrated from the 18th century. So there was a mermaid that would come up out of the shores of the Clyde at Newark Castle and offer herbal remedies to people. She would like sort of, you know, here's a recipe for a medicine that's going to make you feel better, kind of thing. And I just think it's amazing that there's this, you know, we've got this river in a place that we're really, really used to seeing, but that one wee story makes it seem like a magical place. You know, that there's all sorts of things that could be living in there. There could be river monsters and all of that. But the fact that people spent a lot of time seeing a mermaid at the shore of the river, I think that's great, right? And when you tell that story to people, you know, you're telling it in a place where there's now a shipyard, you know, that's where she gets, so mermaid shipyard, and the way that jams together is nice. So yeah, those are my two favourites. So at the moment I'm just at the start of putting together a project which I'm really looking forward to. It's part of the Scottish International Storytelling Festival, and what that's going to be is a storytelling performance in the Beacon. But prior to that, I'm going to work with 3 groups to sort of reinterpret local folk tales. So 3 groups of young people, and they are going to retell the story in their own way. So the performance will have me telling a story of kind of a journey around the town, and then these wee points where the young people are going to be involved in telling a different version of folk tales. So that's really interesting. I'm looking forward to getting started on that. And it's part of this international festival run by the Scottish Storytelling Centre. So it's that way. It feels just a wee tiny bit like, you know, it's like our stories on the map that way. So I'm looking forward to that. And just now I'm writing, and like I was saying earlier, it's just for myself at the moment. I'm writing a book, which is a sort of a children's book, ghost story, which I'm enjoying. And it's at the moment I'm just at the typing it all up, putting it together stage. I think I just want to be able to keep doing it. You know, like I spent a lot of time, as lots of people do, you know, in other jobs while I was writing, and now I'm lucky enough that I'm able to do writing most of the time and to work with community organisations and local people to tell stories, and I've never felt so lucky. So I want to be able to keep doing that. There's no shortage of stories, so I don't have like a big grand ambition, but there is one thing I quite fancy, which is audiobooks were for me like a coping mechanism over the last year and a half. I'm always listening to them, but particularly this last year and a half. And I have this idea of getting a book, getting a story, and creating a community audiobook. So we go and we record lots of people telling that story, but it's in our voice, you know, and it becomes something that doesn't sound like the normal audiobook narration that you might hear. So I quite fancy doing that. Hopefully get a chance to do that next year, because it's the year of stories next year, so a few projects on the go, hopefully.